Billionaire Shelby Boyd sat rigid in first-class seat 2A, his $11 billion empire suddenly meaningless as his 8-month-old daughter Lina screamed like the world was ending. For almost 4 straight hours every passenger had endured the torment, grown men pressing noise-canceling headphones to their skulls, flight attendants on the verge of tears, and Shelby, the man who closed $100 million deals before breakfast, reduced to a shaking wreck begging his baby to stop. He had tried everything. He had walked the aisle until his arms burned, bouncing Lina with the same rhythm he once used to pace boardrooms. He had offered bottles warm to exactly 98 degrees, then room temperature, then cold. He had changed her diaper 3 times in the cramped lavatory, sweat dripping down his back while strangers glared through the curtain gap. He had pressed the expensive silicone pacifiers against her lips, played white noise apps, even held his phone against her ear with recordings of ocean waves and heartbeat drums. Nothing worked. Lina's face had gone scarlet, her tiny fists clenched so tight the knuckles blanched, her cries climbing into a register that felt sharp enough to cut glass. The cabin had turned hostile. A hedge fund legend in 1A kept sighing theatrically and snapping his newspaper. A famous actress 2 rows back filmed a 30-second clip on her caption already forming in her mind about entitled parents who ruined flights. An elderly French diplomat muttered something about American indulgence loud enough for the entire pod to hear. The lead flight attendant, a polished woman named Claire who had served Shelby champagne on a dozen previous flights, now approached with tight lips and offered the same rehearsed suggestions that had already failed. When even she ran out of ideas, the pilot's voice crackled over the speakers with velvet menace, "We ask all passengers to please ensure the comfort of those around them for the remainder of our journey." Shelby felt every word land like a slap. That's when something no one saw coming happened. A quiet white woman from economy walked up the aisle, auburn hair loose around her shoulders, wearing nothing but a simple cream sweater and carrying a small leather satchel. She moved with no hurry, no drama, as if the screams were simply background noise she had learned to walk through. Without a word, without asking permission, she reached Shelby's seat, extended her arms, and took Lina from his trembling hands. Shelby was too exhausted to protest. She pressed the baby gently against her collarbone, tucking Lina's inflamed ear into the hollow just above her heartbeat, and sang one crystal-clear note of an ancient French lullaby. The note floated, pure and warm, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The screaming stopped. Instantly. Completely. Like someone had pressed mute on the entire universe. 200 passengers froze mid-breath. A businessman in 1C actually dropped his glass, it shattered against the carpet and no one moved to clean it. Somewhere behind them a woman began to cry, soft and grateful. Shelby stared, throat raw, eyes burning. The woman cradled his daughter with the ease of someone who had done this a million times and never, ever again. Lina's eyelids fluttered, then closed. Her tiny body went limp in perfect, trusting sleep. Shelby's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "How?" The woman's green eyes filled with tears she hadn't let fall in 6 years. "I used to sing my own daughter to sleep," she whispered, "before I lost her." This is the unbelievable true story of how one white woman's voice saved a billionaire's baby 35,000 feet above the Atlantic, and how that same voice went on to heal thousands more, including the woman who thought her song had died forever. Shelby Boyd was 44 years old, the founder and sole ruler of Boyd Global Properties, a company that owned more skyline than most countries. He had built his fortune turning abandoned warehouses into billion-dollar residences and crumbling palaces into hotels that charged €20,000 a night just to walk through the lobby. On any other week he flew private, surrounded by staff who anticipated his needs before he felt them. But this week his wife Elise lay in a New York hospital bed recovering from a ruptured appendix that had nearly killed her. "Don't you dare cancel Paris," Elise had rasped, for a line snaking from her arm, monitors beeping steady for the first time in 48 hours. "This merger is 20 years of our lives. Take Lina. How hard can 5 days be?" He had believed her. He had hired the most exclusive infant travel specialist on the eastern seaboard. She texted 1 hour before takeoff that she was doubled over with food poisoning. With boarding already closed and the merger documents waiting in a Paris vault, Shelby made the choice that would haunt him for the next 7 hours. He carried his daughter onto a commercial red-eye alone. Lina had been angelic for the first hour, curled in the lie-flat bassinet, rosebud mouth open in sleep while Shelby reviewed final term sheets on his tablet. He had allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. Then the aircraft began its slow descent toward cruising altitude, cabin pressure shifted, and Lina woke up as though someone had poured fire into her ears. The crying started small, a whimper of confusion. Within minutes it became a siren. Within 30 minutes it was a sound Shelby had never heard from a human throat, high and shredded and endless. He recognized the symptoms too late, the way she clawed at her left ear, the fever blooming under her downy hair, the way her whole body arched in agony. Ear infection. Altitude. Trapped fluid turning into torture. He called the only pediatrician he trusted at 3 a.m. New York time. The doctor prescribed children's pain reliever and said, "Get her on the ground as fast as you can." 7 hours to go. Shelby swallowed the medicine himself first to test temperature, then tried to coax it between Lina's lips. She spat it out and screamed harder. He rocked, swayed, shushed, begged. He offered every toy in the diaper bag, every bottle, every blanket. Nothing touched the pain. Passengers stopped pretending politeness. Phones came out. One man in a cashmere scarf stood and demanded the crew do something. Claire returned with warm towels, then cold compresses, then apologies that grew thinner with each trip. At hour 3 Shelby's shirt was soaked with tears, Lina's and his own. He was calculating the cost of turning the plane around, calculating the collapse of the merger, calculating how many billions he would lose if he failed to appear at the signing, when the woman appeared. She had been sitting in 28E, near the rear galley, reading a worn paperback by the dim overhead light. No one had noticed her board. No one noticed her stand. She simply walked the length of the aircraft as though pulled by a string only she could feel, past the curtain that separated worlds, until she stood in front of seat 2A. Shelby looked up, ready to snarl at another complaint. Instead he saw calm green eyes and a face that carried sorrow the way other people carry briefcases. She did not speak. She simply opened her arms. He surrendered Lina without thinking. The moment her hands touched his daughter, Shelby felt the shift. Not hope, not yet. Just the absence of resistance. Lina's rigid little body softened by degrees. The woman tilted her head so Lina's ear rested exactly against the pulse in her neck, and she began to sing. The lullaby was old, older than airplanes, older than billionaires. The French words were soft, rounded, each syllable placed like a cool cloth on burning skin. The melody rose and fell with the rhythm of a mother's heartbeat. Shelby did not understand the lyrics, but he felt them in his bones. Lina's fists uncurled. Her mouth stopped its terrible O of pain. Her breathing slowed, deepened, evened out. Within 30 seconds she was asleep so profoundly that her head lolled, trusting, against a stranger's chest. The cabin remained silent long after the last note faded. Then someone in the back began to clap, slow and reverent. Others joined until the sound swelled into something between applause and prayer. Shelby could not move. He stared at the woman who had just done what his money, his power, and 7 hours of desperation could not. Up close, she looked tired. Fine lines framed her eyes. Her sweater had a tiny pills at the cuffs. The leather satchel at her feet was cracked with years of use. Yet she held his daughter like the most precious thing on earth. How? He asked again, barely a breath. Annabella McClure looked down at the sleeping baby, then back at him. Tears slipped free and traced clean paths through the faint dust of travel on her cheeks. "I used to sing my own daughter to sleep," she said, voice breaking on every word, "before I lost her." Outside the windows, dawn bled rose and gold across the clouds. Inside seat 2A, a billionaire who owned half the world's landmarks suddenly understood how little any of it mattered when one small life was in pain. And in the hush that followed, with Lina's even breathing the only sound in first class, Shelby Boyd knew this flight had already changed everything. The hush that followed Annabella's lullaby did not break so much as it folded itself around them, soft and protective, like the blanket Lina now slept beneath. Shelby remained half-standing in the aisle, afraid to move, afraid the spell would shatter. The flight attendants hovered nearby, eyes wide, unsure whether to speak or simply witness. No one wanted the crying to start again. Annabella shifted Lina higher against her shoulder and began to sway, the smallest motion, barely more than breathing. She hummed the same lullaby under her breath, not loud enough to disturb, just enough to keep the pain at bay. Every few bars she adjusted the angle of Lina's head so the inflamed ear stayed pressed to the steady pulse in her neck. Shelby watched, transfixed, as his daughter's face smoothed into perfect peace. "May I sit?" Annabella asked quietly, nodding toward the empty window seat beside him. Shelby snapped out of his daze. "Please." "Yes. Of course." He gathered the scattered bottles and toys with shaking hands, clearing space as though the seat were made of gold. Claire, the lead attendant, appeared instantly to remove the armrest and lay a fresh blanket across the leather. Annabella settled in without ceremony. Lina never stirred. The cabin lights had dimmed to night mode, casting soft amber pools that made Annabella's auburn hair glow like embers. She kept one hand cupped beneath Lina's bottom, the other supporting the tiny head, and resumed the gentle hum. Shelby lowered himself beside them, careful not to jostle the seat. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. "Name your price." "Anything." Annabella shook her head almost imperceptibly. "I didn't do it for payment." "Then let me compensate you anyway." "A wire transfer. A foundation donation. Whatever you want." She glanced at him then, green eyes calm and ancient with sorrow. "Some things can't be bought, Mr. Boyd. Only given." He swallowed, the words landing deeper than any negotiation he had ever faced. For the first time in years he felt utterly out of his depth. The next 3 hours passed in a hush that felt sacred. Annabella never surrendered Lina, not even when the attendants offered to warm another bottle or when turbulence rocked the aircraft. She simply tightened her hold and adjusted the angle of her collarbone, explaining in murmurs when Shelby asked how she knew what to do. "It's about resonance," she said, voice barely audible over the engines. "The bones here," she touched just below her throat, carry vibration directly to the inner ear. When the pressure is unbearable, a frequency that matches the mother's heartbeat can open the eustachian tubes just enough to equalize. My voice happens to sit in the exact range most infants respond to. Shelby stared. "You're a doctor?" "No. I'm a listener." She brushed a curl from Lina's damp forehead. "Pain has a sound. Relief has another. I learned to speak the second one." He wanted to ask more, needed to ask more, but every time he opened his mouth she began humming again and the questions dissolved. Passengers kept stealing glances. Phones rose slowly, discreetly, as people searched the name they had overheard when Shelby thanked her. The whispers started 10 minutes later. "That's her. I'm sure of it." The voice of last resort. "Look at the eyes. It's definitely her." A woman across the aisle showed her husband an article on her screen, volume muted, eyes wide. Shelby caught the headline, "The Woman Royals Call When All Hope Is Lost." His own phone buzzed against his thigh. He had forgotten it existed. The message was from his executive assistant, Margot, who monitored everything from New York even at 4 in the morning. "Margot, sir, the woman holding Lina is Annabella McClure. Pediatric voice therapist. Waiting list is 3 years. Fee starts at $50K per hour, cash only, no insurance, no press. She only takes cases doctors have given up on. She hasn't accepted a new client in 18 months. How is she on your flight?" Another message followed before he could type a reply. "Margot, private jets beg for her. She always refuses. She flies commercial and books under false names. Sir, you have the one person on earth no amount of money can book." Shelby looked at the woman beside him, at the frayed cuff of her sweater, the cracked leather satchel tucked beneath the seat in front of her, the way she cradled his daughter like the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing in the world. Annabella felt his gaze and offered a small, sad smile. "They always find out eventually," she murmured. "I'm sorry if it disturbs your privacy." "I don't care about that," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "I care that my daughter is finally sleeping. And that you're the reason." She glanced down at Lina, thumb-stroking the baby's cheek. "She's beautiful. She feels safe now. That's all that matters." He wanted to ask about the daughter she had lost, wanted to ask why her hands trembled almost imperceptibly when she thought no one was watching, wanted to ask why she flew economy when the world would have laid red carpets at her feet. But the raw grief in her eyes stopped him. Some doors, he understood instinctively, were not meant to be opened at 35,000 feet. Instead he asked, "Will you stay with us until we land?" "Just until she's through the descent." The pressure change coming down is worse. Annabella nodded without hesitation. "I won't let her hurt again." The final hour unfolded like a dream. The cabin remained hushed, as though the entire aircraft had agreed to protect the fragile peace. Passengers who had cursed Shelby hours earlier now watched with something close to reverence. Claire brought warm towels and a fresh blanket without being asked. A doctor traveling in business class stopped by, introduced himself quietly, and confirmed in a stunned whisper that Lina's fever was already dropping. Annabella never raised her voice above a murmur. When Lina stirred, she shifted position and began a different song, lower this time, the notes thrumming through her chest into the baby's ear like warm water. Shelby sat motionless, afraid to break whatever magic was holding his daughter together. He tried once more, gently. "When we land, I have a car, doctors, anything you need." "I know," she said, not unkindly. "But I'll be gone before you reach the gate." The words hit him like cold water. "You can't. She'll wake up. The pain will come back." "It always does," Annabella replied, and the sorrow in her voice was older than the ocean beneath them. "But she'll be on the ground by then. And you'll be with her." Shelby opened his mouth to argue, to offer apartments, private wings, entire buildings if she would only stay, but the seatbelt sign illuminated and the captain announced final descent into Paris. The aircraft banked, engines whining, and Lina whimpered in her sleep. Annabella immediately pressed the baby closer and began the lullaby again, stronger now, weaving French syllables with a tenderness that made Shelby's chest ache. Lina quieted instantly. The pressure built in all their ears, but Lina slept through it, cocooned in resonance and warmth. As the wheels touched tarmac and the cabin filled with the usual rustle of seat belts and overhead bins, Annabella carefully transferred the still-sleeping baby into Shelby's waiting arms. Lina stirred only enough to nestle against her father's chest, tiny fist curling into his shirt. Annabella stood, smoothing her sweater, reaching for the satchel. Shelby rose with her, desperate. "Please. At least let me." She placed a gentle finger against his lips, silencing him the way she had silenced the pain. "Take care of her," she whispered. "That's all the thanks I'll ever need." Then she was walking away, down the aisle toward economy, auburn hair catching the first gray light of Paris dawn. Passengers parted for her without realizing why. Some reached out to touch her sleeve as she passed, as though she carried blessing in her fingertips. Shelby stood frozen, clutching his daughter, watching the woman who had saved them both disappear into the crowd. Only later, when the engines powered down and the doors opened to reveal the waiting convoy of black cars, did he understand the full weight of what had just happened. He held in his arms the living proof that the one person on earth no amount of money could ever book had spent 7 hours refusing to let his daughter suffer. And she was walking away before he even learned how to ask her to stay. The jet bridge emptied into the controlled chaos of Charles de Gaulle Terminal 2E. Flashbulbs erupted the moment Shelby stepped through the gate. Photographers who usually waited for starlets and heads of state had been tipped off that the American billionaire was arriving alone with a baby, and the images of him disheveled and desperate on the plane had already begun circulating on private WhatsApp groups. Now they surged forward, shouting questions in French and English, lenses trained on the tiny bundle in his arms. Lina stirred at the noise, a warning whimper rising in her throat. Shelby's security team formed a tight wedge, but the crowd pressed closer. He felt panic clawing at him again. One flash too bright, one shout too sharp, and the fragile piece would shatter. Then he saw her. Annabella stood 10 meters back, half hidden behind a pillar, satchel clutched to her chest like a shield. She had been swallowed by the tide of disembarking economy passengers, yet her eyes found his instantly across the chaos. The moment Lina's whimper became a wail, Annabella was moving. She slipped between bodies with the same quiet certainty she had shown on the plane, reaching Shelby just as Lina drew breath for a scream that would rip them both apart. Without ceremony she took the baby again, pressed her to that same hollow above her heartbeat, and began the lullaby. The cry died before it began. Cameras lowered. Even the photographers fell silent, stunned by the sudden stillness in the middle of pandemonium. Security cleared a path. Shelby walked beside her, one hand hovering protectively near Lina's back, afraid to touch, afraid not to. The convoy of black Mercedes waited at the curb. His driver, Laurent, opened the rear door with practiced calm, but his eyes widened when he saw who held the child. Annabella hesitated on the pavement, the cold Paris morning raising gooseflesh on her arms beneath the thin sweater. "I can take the RER," she said softly. "You're safe now." No, the word came out rougher than Shelby intended. He cleared his throat. "Please. Just for tonight. The hotel is 10 minutes away. Let her sleep. Let me get a doctor who isn't treating her at 35,000 feet." Annabella looked down at Lina, whose tiny fingers had curled into the cream wool like it was the only safe place left in the world. Something flickered across her face, too quick to name. "One night," she agreed. They slid into the warmth of the limousine. The partition rose, sealing them in leather-scented quiet. Laurent pulled away from the curb and the airport fell behind them. For 3 blocks Lina stayed calm. Then the motion of the car, the subtle shift of temperature, the absence of airplane engines, something triggered the pain again. Lina's face crumpled. The cry that tore out of her was worse than any on the flight, raw and terrified now that she had tasted relief. Annabella did not flinch. She simply gathered the baby closer and began to sing. Not the lullaby this time, something lower, slower, a wordless vibration that seemed to come from the center of the earth. Lina's mouth opened, closed, opened again, and the scream dissolved into a shuddering sigh. Within seconds she was asleep once more. Shelby watched, helpless and awed. "How do you do that?" "I don't," Annabella answered, eyes on Lina. "She does. I only remind her she's allowed to stop hurting." The drive to the Hotel Plaza Atheny took 8 minutes. Laurent took every corner as though the car carried nitroglycerin. When they swept under the red awning, the concierge and 2 assistant managers were already waiting. Shelby had owned the entire top floor for years, the staff knew the protocol for dignitaries and royalty. They had never seen him arrive carrying a child and followed by a woman in economy clothes who held that child like it belonged to her. In the private elevator, Lina slept on. Annabella's arms had begun to tremble with fatigue, but she did not shift her grip. The doors opened directly into the residence, pale wood floors, champagne-colored silk walls, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Eiffel Tower glowing gold against the dawn. Shelby had always thought of the suite as a showroom. Now it felt cavernous and cold. 2 pediatricians waited in the salon, summoned from Hospital Necker by a single phone call and a blank check. They approached with the hushed reverence usually reserved for fragile antiquities. Annabella laid Lina on the examination blanket with infinite care. The moment contact broke, Lina's eyes flew open and her mouth formed the familiar O of agony. Annabella was already singing before the cry escaped. The doctors froze, instruments half-raised, as the baby quieted again. One of them, Dr. Marchand, a woman with steel-gray hair and 40 years of experience, actually took a step back. "Mon Dieu," she whispered. "I have heard rumors, but I did not believe." They worked around the song. Otoscope, thermometer, gentle palpation of swollen lymph nodes. When they needed Lina's head turned, Annabella turned with her, never breaking the chain of sound. Diagnosis came quickly: severe bilateral otitis media with effusion, made catastrophic by pressure changes. Without intervention, the child would have been in agony for days, risking perforation. Dr. Marchand looked at Annabella with something close to worship. "Whatever you are doing, do not stop until the antibiotics have 24 hours. Annabella nodded, exhausted but steady. The doctors left prescriptions and quiet promises to return. The staff vanished. The suite fell silent except for the faint hum of the city 7 floors below and the endless, healing thread of Annabella's voice. Shelby waited until Lina was settled in the portable crib the concierge had produced from somewhere, until her breathing had deepened into genuine sleep without the prop of song. Then he turned to the woman who had not sat down once since boarding the plane in New York. "Stay," he said. It was not a request. Annabella stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself as though holding her own pieces together. The morning light caught the auburn in her hair and the exhaustion in her eyes. "I can't," she answered. "I never stay." "You stayed on the plane. You stayed in the car. Stay one more night. 1 week. 1 month." He took a step closer, careful not to crowd her. "I have an apartment on the 6th floor. Empty. Yours for as long as you want it. No rent. No questions. Treat any child you choose. Bring them here, or I'll fly you anywhere. Name your terms." She shook her head, but the refusal was slower this time, fraying at the edges. "I don't want money," she said, voice raw from hours of singing. "I don't want apartments or private cars." "Then what do you want?" He spread his hands, helpless in a way no boardroom had ever made him. "Tell me." "Anything." Annabella turned to the window. Below them, the Seine caught the first real light of day, turning the water to molten copper. She was quiet so long he thought she would not answer. "I want to build something," she said finally, so softly he almost missed it. "A place where no parent ever has to stand in an airport or sit on a plane or lie awake at night listening to that scream and knowing there is nothing they can do. A place where the first thing a child hears when the pain is too much is a voice that understands. Not for money. Not for kings. For every child. Free. Forever." She faced him then, green eyes fierce with a purpose that had been sleeping for years. "I want to build something that never lets another parent feel what we felt today." Shelby felt the words settle into his bones like the final piece of a puzzle he had not known he was solving. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped just short of touching her. "Name it," he said, voice rough with certainty. "It's yours." Outside, Paris woke beneath them, oblivious to the fact that 2 broken hearts had just made a promise that would change the city forever. Paris was fully awake now, sunlight pouring gold across the suite and turning the pale silk walls the color of warm cream. Lina slept on in the portable crib, one fist curled against her cheek, the rise and fall of her chest steady for the first time in 36 hours. The room felt suspended, as though the city itself held its breath. Annabella stood at the window, palms pressed flat against the glass, staring down at the Seine as if answers might float to the surface. Shelby watched her from across the room, afraid to speak, afraid the fragile bridge they had built in the dark would collapse in daylight. Minutes passed. Maybe 10. Maybe 20. Then her shoulders began to tremble, the smallest tremor at first, almost imperceptible. A sound escaped her, not a sob, not yet, something deeper, like a note held too long and finally released. She folded forward, forehead touching the cool pane, and the tremor became shaking. Shelby crossed the distance in silence. He did not touch her, only stood close enough that she could feel his presence if she needed it. She did not turn, but the shaking grew harder, until her breath fogged the glass in short, ragged bursts. "I sang it," she whispered to her own reflection. "After all this time, I sang it." Shelby waited. He had learned, somewhere between the plane and this moment, that some silences were sacred. Annabella's voice, when it came again, was raw, stripped of every layer she used to protect herself. Her name was Eloise. She said the name like a prayer and a wound. She was 7 months and 4 days old. Same age Lina is now. Same weight, almost to the gram. Same curl at the nape of the neck. Annabella turned then, sliding down until she sat on the wide windowsill, knees drawn to her chest. Her eyes were dry, but the pain in them was wet and endless. She was born with laryngeal cleft type 4. So rare most doctors have never seen it. The airway never formed properly. Every breath was borrowed. Every cry cost her. We knew from the first week she might not stay. She spoke without drama, the way people speak when the story has been carried so long it has worn smooth in places, sharp in others. I was a coloratura soprano before she came. Opera houses in Vienna, Milan, New York. I could float a high F that made conductors weep. But the moment they laid her in my arms, none of that mattered. I only wanted to sing her to sleep. My mother sang me an old Provençal lullaby when I was small. Dodo, l'enfant du. I sang it to Eloise every night. Only that song. Only that key. It was the one sound that opened her airway just enough to let her rest. Annabella's gaze drifted to the crib where Lina slept. The night she left us, the machine started screaming first. Alarms, red lights, nurses running. I picked her up because she hated the cold plastic of the cot. I held her the way I'm holding Lina now, ear against my pulse, and I sang. I sang while they tried to intubate. I sang while they compressed her tiny chest. I sang when the doctor said there was nothing more. I sang until the monitors went flat and the room went quiet and my husband pulled me away because I wouldn't stop. I sang that lullaby until they took her from my arms. She pressed a fist to her mouth, rocking slightly. I buried it with her. The song. My voice. Everything. I walked out of the hospital and didn't sing again. Not once. Not even in the shower. Not even when I thought no one could hear. Shelby's throat ached. He had negotiated with dictators and tycoons, had stared down men who could buy countries, but nothing had ever left him this speechless. 2 years, she continued, voice steadier now, as though telling the story to the city instead of to him. 2 years of nothing. I sold the apartment in Lyon, gave away her clothes, moved from city to city like a ghost. Then one night in a hospital in Lisbon, a mother was screaming the way I once screamed. Her baby was failing to thrive, no diagnosis, no hope. The nurses were crying. I stood outside the NICU door and heard the same pitch of pain I knew by heart. I walked in without thinking. I picked the baby up. And I sang, not Eloise's song, something else, something safe. The baby quieted. The mother looked at me like I had pulled her child back from death. Word spread. They started calling. First one hospital, then another. Royals, oligarchs, desperate parents who had been told nothing more could be done. I became the voice of last resort because I had nothing left to lose. I flew commercial, stayed in hostels, took only the cases no one else would touch. And I never, ever sang her lullaby again. Until tonight. Until your daughter. She looked at Shelby then, really looked, and the tears finally came, silent rivers down pale cheeks. Lina heard it and answered. She quieted the way Eloise used to. The same breath. The same surrender. For the first time in 6 years, the song worked for someone else. Shelby sank to one knee in front of her, the way a man kneels before something holy. I don't know what to say that isn't useless, he said, voice rough. But I know what I felt when she stopped crying on that plane. I know what I'm feeling now, watching you look at my daughter like she's a second chance you never expected. Stay. Not for me. Not even for Lina. Stay because the world still needs that song, and maybe you need to sing it again. Annabella wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, leaving faint streaks of exhaustion. I can't stay forever, she said. I never do. Then stay for 1 month, Shelby countered gently. 30 days. Long enough to be sure Lina heals completely. Long enough to sit with architects and doctors and dream this place you spoke of. Draw it on napkins if you have to. Let me build the walls around the song. After 30 days, if you still need to leave, I'll open the door myself. But give the song 30 days. She studied him for a long moment, searching for the catch, the agenda, the trap that wealth always carried. She found none. 30 days, she echoed, the words tasting foreign and possible at once. 30 days, he repeated, and offered his hand, not as a billionaire, not as a father bargaining for his child, but as one human being who recognized another carrying unbearable weight. Annabella looked at the outstretched hand, then at Lina sleeping peacefully for the first time since New York. Finally she placed her palm in his. Her fingers were cold, calloused from years of carrying suitcases and other people's children, but they did not tremble anymore. Outside, a church bell rang 7 times across the rooftops of Paris, clear and silver in the morning air. 30 days. It was long enough for scars to begin healing, long enough for plans to take shape, long enough for a lullaby that had died 6 years ago to remember it still had work to do. Annabella stood, walked to the crib, and looked down at the sleeping baby who had unknowingly called her back to life. She did not sing, not yet. But for the first time since burying her daughter, she allowed herself to hum, just one soft note, barely louder than breathing. Lina smiled in her sleep. And in that quiet Paris morning, with the city waking beneath them and a promise hanging fragile in the air, Annabella McClure began, almost without realizing it, to come back to the world. The church bell had barely finished its 7th chime when Shelby's phone began to vibrate against the marble console. London, New York, Zurich, the merger machinery was already spinning. Lawyers wanted signatures, bankers wanted assurances, the European partners had landed and were waiting at the Palais de Congrès with champagne and cameras. He silenced the calls one by one, then turned the phone face down and looked at Annabella. "I'm clearing the next 4 days," he said. "Everything. The merger can wait." She started to protest, but he was already moving, dialing his assistant Margot in New York, voice calm and absolute. "Push the signing to Friday. Tell them family emergency. Tell them whatever you have to. And get me the best pediatric acoustical engineers on the planet. I don't care what it costs or where they are. Have them in Paris by tonight." He hung up before Margot could finish gasping. Annabella watched him, arms folded beneath the cream sweater that was now permanently creased from cradling Lina. "You can't pause a €200 billion deal for a dream on hotel stationery." "I just did." That was the beginning. By midnight the suite had become something between a war room and a sanctuary. The long dining table was buried under blueprints and coffee cups. Architects from Copenhagen and Tokyo argued softly in 3 languages over load-bearing walls. A pediatric ENT from Boston kept shaking his head and muttering impossible until Annabella hummed a single descending scale and he went quiet, eyes wide. An acoustical engineer from Munich measured the resonance of the crystal water glasses with a tuning fork, nodding like a man who had just heard angels. Annabella sat cross-legged on the carpet, hair twisted up with a pencil, sleeves rolled high. She drew on whatever was at hand, the thick cream stationery of the Plaza Athénée, the backs of merger contracts, even the inside of a takeaway pizza box when the paper ran out. Her sketches were rough but certain. A circular emergency wing that opened directly off the street, no appointments, no paperwork, no questions. A child in pain would be carried through the doors and into treatment within 90 seconds. Resonance rooms lined with living wood and tuned to exact frequencies, each one calibrated to the range that opened blocked eustachian tubes or soothed neurological distress. Parent sleep pods tucked like nests along the corridors, because no one healed a child while running on terror and exhaustion. A rooftop garden where families could breathe while the city glittered below, and where Annabella's voice could drift on summer nights and find every open window. Everything free. Forever. Shelby stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. "How much?" he asked quietly. She did not look up. 200 million to build. 10 million a year to run. More if we do it right. Done. She did look up then, green eyes sharp. "You haven't even read the full plan." "I don't need to." I heard it in Lina's silence on the plane. At 2:17 a.m. the video conference with the board began. 12 faces appeared on the massive screen, time zones be damned. Shelby had not changed clothes since New York. He looked like a man who had fought a war and discovered the only thing worth winning was a baby's peaceful sleep. The chairman, a Swiss banker named Henri who had known Shelby for 25 years, spoke first. Shelby, we understand family comes first, but postponing the signing risks the entire consortium. And this, diversion, 200 million euros because of a singer you met on a plane? Several heads nodded. One woman in London actually laughed, the sound brittle across fiber-optic cables. Shelby did not raise his voice. He simply turned the laptop on the table so the camera caught Annabella sitting on the floor, surrounded by sketches, hair escaping its pencil, eyes burning with exhausted fire. This, he said, is the singer. He pressed play on the file Margot had sent, grainy phone footage from the flight, shot by a passenger in 4C. For hours of Lina's screams, the cabin's descent into fury, then Annabella walking up the aisle. One note. Silence. The collective intake of breath that sounded like prayer. The boardroom went still. Henry's mouth opened, closed. The woman in London looked as though someone had struck her. Shelby let the silence stretch. Then he spoke, quiet and lethal. That is what 200 million euros buys. A world where no parent ever has to hear that sound and be powerless again. Vote however you want. I'm writing the check either way. He ended the call. Annabella had not moved. You just risked your empire for an idea that exists on pizza cardboard. I risked it the moment I handed you my daughter on that plane, he said. Everything else is details. At 3:42 a.m. the Munich engineer declared the resonance chambers theoretically possible. The Boston ENT started crying quietly and could not explain why. Someone ordered more coffee. The sketches kept growing. Lina woke once, around 4, fever finally broken, cheeks pink instead of scarlet. Annabella lifted her from the crib without thinking, settling the baby against her shoulder the way she had 100 times in the last day. Lina blinked gummy eyes, looked up at the woman whose heartbeat had become her new North Star, and did something she had never done before. She giggled. Not a cough, not a coo. A bright, bubbling giggle that lit the room like sunrise. She reached one starfish hand toward Annabella's mouth, patting the air as if trying to catch the next note before it escaped. The architects stopped talking. The engineers forgot their calculations. Even the night porter who had just delivered yet another tray of croissants froze in the doorway. Annabella's eyes filled so fast the tears spilled over before she could stop them. She pressed her lips to Lina's downy hair and laughed through the tears, the sound shaky and astonished and alive. Shelby felt something crack open in his chest, something he had not known was closed. He crossed the room, knelt beside them, and rested his forehead against Annabella's shoulder, the three of them forming a small, imperfect circle on the carpet of a Paris suite at dawn. Lina giggled again, louder, as if the sound itself was medicine. Annabella looked at Shelby over the baby's head, eyes shining with fear and wonder in equal measure. She's going to be all right, she whispered. We all are, he answered. Outside, the sky over the Seine shifted from indigo to rose. Inside, the blueprint spread across the table like a promise taking its first breath. The Lina McClure Center existed only in pencil and pizza grease and the laughter of a child who had forgotten what pain felt like. But it existed. And for the first time in 6 years, Annabella allowed herself to believe that some things, once shattered, could still be made whole. The rose-colored dawn had barely faded into ordinary morning when the first notification pinged. Shelby was asleep on the sofa, jacket crumpled beneath his cheek, one hand still resting on the edge of Lina's crib. Annabella sat at the table, surrounded by sketches now numbered and annotated in 3 colors of ink, humming under her breath as she refined the curve of the emergency wing. Lina gurgled in her sleep, chasing dreams that no longer hurt. Margot's name flashed on the silent phone, emergency, call now. Shelby jerked awake, heart already racing before his eyes opened. He took the call in the adjoining study, closing the door softly behind him. When he returned 10 minutes later, his face had gone the color of ash. Annabella knew before he spoke. She had lived with this particular silence before. "They have photographs," he said, voice flat. "Us at the airport. In the car. Lina in your arms. The headlines are," he stopped, jaw tight. "They're calling you my mystery woman. Some are worse." He turned the tablet so she could see. "Billionaire secret Paris fling? Mystery redhead comms tycoon's baby, but who is she? Shelby Boyd's mid-flight mistress?" The images were grainy but unmistakable, Annabella taking Lina from his arms on the jet bridge, the limousine door closing behind them, a long lens shot through the hotel window of her holding the baby while Shelby stood too close. Someone had stitched together passenger videos from the flight and sold them to the highest bidder. Annabella felt the old familiar ice slide through her veins. "It gets worse," Shelby continued. "They dug up everything. Old interviews after Eloise. A grief-stricken quote taken out of context where I said doctors told us to prepare for the worst, and I answered that love was stronger than medicine. They're calling it the false hope scandal. Saying I gave desperate parents unrealistic expectations. There's a petition with 30,000 signatures demanding I never be allowed near another sick child." She stood slowly, as though the air had thickened. "I'll leave within the hour. You can say I was a hired consultant who resigned. The story dies." "No," the single word cracked like ice breaking. "It's the only way," she said, already moving toward the bedroom where her satchel waited, the same cracked leather bag that had traveled the world with her. "I'm poison. I always have been since Eloise. I should never have stayed." Shelby caught her wrist before she reached the door. "You are not leaving my daughter because some vultures learned how to use Google. Your merger can survive. Lina cannot survive you disappearing again." She tried to pull free, gentle but firm. "You don't understand. They'll keep digging. They'll find every parent I couldn't save, every case that ended badly. They'll turn your gift into something ugly. I won't let that happen." At that moment Lina woke fully and let out a small, confused cry, the first edge of discomfort in days. Annabella's body moved before her mind caught up. She was at the crib in 3 strides, lifting the baby, pressing her close, humming the lullaby that was no longer buried. Lina quieted instantly, nuzzling into the familiar hollow above Annabella's heart. Shelby watched them, something fierce and protective rising in his chest. "Listen to me," he said, voice low. "In 2 hours I have a press conference scheduled for the merger postponement. I'm going to tell the truth. All of it. With your permission." Annabella went very still. "You can't." "I can, and I will." He was already dialing Margot again, issuing orders in clipped sentences, medical records release form, hospital consent from New York, the passenger footage with timestamps, Dr. Marchand on standby for comment. Annabella sank into the nearest chair, Lina clutched like a shield. "They'll destroy you." "They'll try," Shelby said. "They won't succeed." By noon the grand salon of the hotel was packed with journalists who had expected a routine financial announcement and instead found themselves facing a man who looked like he had not slept in days and did not care. Shelby walked to the podium alone. No notes. No corporate backdrop. Just the simple hotel logo and a blown-up photograph behind him, Lina, red-faced and screaming on the plane, timestamp 3:14 a.m., followed by the exact same angle 30 seconds later, peaceful in Annabella's arms. He did not open with pleasantries. 48 hours ago, he began, voice steady, "My 8-month-old daughter developed a severe bilateral ear infection at 35,000 feet. For 4 hours she was in agony. Every resource I have, every dollar, every contact, was useless. Then a woman who had no reason to help us walked from economy class and did what no doctor on call could do. She saved my child with nothing but her voice." Cameras flashed like lightning. That woman is Annabella McClure. 6 years ago she lost her own daughter to a rare congenital disorder. Since then she has flown the world, anonymously, treating only the children no one else can reach. She does not advertise. She does not charge most families. She disappears the moment the crisis ends. Until yesterday, she had not sung her daughter's lullaby aloud since the night Eloise died. He clicked to the next slide, Lina's hospital records from Necker, the otoscope images of inflamed eardrums, the pediatrician's notes that read, resolution inexplicable without continued resonance therapy. These are my daughter's medical files, released with legal consent. Judge for yourself what is real. A murmur rippled through the room. Questions exploded. Shelby raised a hand. One more thing. There is a competitor who believes this merger can be won by spreading lies about Ms. McClure's past and my judgment. Let me be perfectly clear, I am postponing the largest deal of my career not because I am emotionally compromised, but because I have seen what one voice can do when the world has run out of answers. I intend to give that voice a permanent home. The Lina McClure Center for Pediatric Voice and Hearing will open in Paris within 2 years, funded entirely by me, free to every child on Earth. He stepped back from the microphone as the room erupted. In the wings, unseen by the cameras, Annabella stood with Lina in her arms, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. For the first time since burying her daughter, she did not feel like running. Back in the suite an hour later, the world was already changing. Donations poured in from strangers who had seen the press conference livestream. Parents sent videos of their own children in pain, begging for help. The petition against Annabella collapsed under an avalanche of counter-stories from families she had saved. Shelby closed the door on the chaos and leaned against it, exhaustion finally winning. Annabella looked at him across the room, Lina asleep on her shoulder. You just told the entire world my deepest wound, she said softly. I told them your greatest strength, he answered. She crossed to him, laid her free hand against his cheek. I thought I was going to ruin you. You saved me first, he said. Remember? Outside, Paris carried on, unaware that a secret once sharp enough to cut had just been forged into something unbreakable. The scandal did not die, it transformed. Within 48 hours the leaked photographs that were meant to shame became the most shared images in Europe. Parents who had never dared hope posted their own grainy videos of Annabella in hospital corridors, airport gates, refugee camps, always the same quiet woman in the cream sweater, always a child suddenly peaceful in her arms. The petition against her turned into a gratitude wall with 500,000 signatures. Hashtags were born, hashtag the voice of last resort, hashtag let her sing. Shelby watched the tide turn from the suite that no longer felt like a hotel room but like the fragile cradle of something unstoppable. He made one phone call to the consortium partners and changed everything. We're moving the signing, he told them. New location. You'll get the coordinates tomorrow. Come or don't. The deal happens either way. They came. On a cool October evening, 800 people in black tie and couture were ferried by private launch along the Seine to an address that did not yet officially exist. Construction fencing still ringed the site, floodlights carved golden tunnels through the dust, and the half-finished building rose like a promise made of steel and glass. A single red carpet led from the water's edge to a temporary pavilion draped in white linen. No one understood what they were walking into. Shelby stood at the entrance beside the architects, greeting each arrival with the same quiet sentence, "Thank you for trusting me." Inside the shell, the ground floor had been cleared to raw concrete. Temporary chandeliers floated overhead, casting soft constellations on exposed beams. At the far end, where the emergency wing would one day open directly onto the quay, a simple stage had been built, no backdrop, no branding, only a single microphone and the night sky visible through the open roof. Annabella waited in the shadows, wearing a plain silk dress the color of moonlight, hair loose for the first time in years. Lina, now completely well, healthy color in her cheeks and mischief in her eyes, rested on her hip in a tiny white dress that matched Annabella's. Shelby had offered jewels, designers, anything. Annabella had chosen simplicity. Some things, she said, should speak for themselves. At 8 o'clock sharp the string quartet that had been warming up fell silent. Shelby walked alone to the center of the stage. Conversation hushed. He did not thank the consortium for their patience or congratulate them on the record-breaking merger. He spoke only 6 sentences. 2 weeks ago my daughter almost broke me 35,000 feet above the Atlantic. One woman walked out of economy and gave her back to me. Tonight we are not here to sign papers. We are here to begin repayment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the future home of the Lina McClure Center for Pediatric Voice and Hearing. He turned and extended his hand toward the wings. Annabella stepped into the light. 800 people drew breath at once. Cameras that had been forbidden inside were suddenly everywhere, phones raised, live streams igniting across the planet. The linen walls glowed with projected images, the airport photographs, the plane footage, Lina's hospital records, the sketches born on pizza boxes now rendered in precise architectural elevations. Annabella walked to the microphone as though walking back into a life she had buried. Lina waved one chubby fist at the sea of faces and laughed, the sound bright and unafraid. Shelby took his daughter so Annabella's hands would be free. Lina immediately nestled into her father's shoulder, eyes fixed on the woman who had become her North Star. Annabella looked out at the silent crowd, investors worth trillions, journalists who could make or break empires, doctors who had flown in from 6 continents just to witness what rumors claimed was impossible. She did not introduce herself. She simply closed her eyes, drew one steady breath, and began to sing. The lullaby poured out of her like water long dammed. Dodo, l'enfant Dieu. The ancient Provençal words floated through the open roof and over the Seine, carried on a voice that had not performed in public since the night her daughter died. It was softer than anyone expected, yet it filled every corner of the vast space, wrapping around steel beams and human hearts with the same impossible gentleness it had once used to keep a failing airway open for one more hour, one more minute. Lina heard it and began to move. Not crying, not fussing, dancing. Her small body swayed in Shelby's arms, one hand reaching toward the sound as though trying to catch moonlight. She kicked her feet in perfect 4/4 time, giggles bubbling between the phrases of the song. Shelby could not help it, he laughed through the tears sliding down his face and danced with her, turning slow circles so every camera could see the child who had screamed for 4 hours now radiant with joy. Annabella's eyes opened. She looked directly at them, father and daughter moving together under her voice, and something inside her that had been frozen for 6 years cracked wide open. Tears fell, but the song never wavered. If anything, it grew stronger, richer, as though grief and love had finally decided to live in the same breath. When the last note faded, the silence lasted 3 full heartbeats. Then the pavilion erupted. Not polite applause, something raw, closer to weeping. People stood without thinking, handkerchiefs pressed to faces, strangers embracing. Phones trembled in outstretched hands as millions watched live around the world. Shelby returned to the microphone, Lina now perched triumphantly on his hip. Construction begins tomorrow, he said, voice rough. We open in 18 months. Every euro of profit from tonight's merger will flow into this building until it can stand on its own. And it will be free, forever, to every child who needs it. He did not need to ask for donations. Within 90 seconds the first alert chimed on the screen behind him, 500,000 euros from an anonymous viewer in Tokyo. Then another. And another. By the time Annabella stepped forward again to sing the lullaby a second time, this time with 800 voices trying, imperfectly, to follow, over 43 million euros had been pledged. Later, when the boats carried the guests back into the Paris night and the floodlights dimmed, only 3 people remained on the concrete floor beneath the open sky. Shelby set Lina down between them. The baby took 3 wobbling steps toward Annabella, arms raised, demanding to be picked up. Annabella lifted her, pressing a kiss to the soft curls. Above them, the unfinished beams framed a rectangle of stars. Shelby spoke so quietly the river almost carried his words away. Paris just heard you sing again. Annabella looked at him over Lina's head, eyes shining like the city lights on water. No, she whispered. Paris heard Eloise sing through me. And she finally got her lullaby in public. Lina reached up and patted Annabella's wet cheek, then laid her head on the familiar shoulder and sighed the deep, trusting sigh of a child who had never known anything but safety in those arms. Far away, screen still glowed with the livestream replay, and somewhere a mother who had been refreshing the page every 5 minutes closed her laptop, kissed her own sleeping baby, and for the first time in months did not cry herself to sleep. The center was no longer a dream on hotel stationery. It had a foundation poured in tears, a roof open to the stars, and a voice that had come back from the grave to prove love could still build things. And on a half-finished floor beside the Seine, 3 people stood together while the lullaby lingered in the air like a blessing the city would never forget. 6 months later, Paris had slipped into the soft gray hush of early spring. Cherry blossoms drifted along the Seine like pale confetti, and the Lina McClure Center rose gleaming on the left bank, its curved glass facade catching the light the way Annabella's voice once caught pain and turned it into peace. The building was weeks from opening. Final fittings hummed day and night, resonance panels tuned to within 1/100th of a hertz, parent sleep pods lined in pale birch, the emergency wing's great doors painted the exact shade of dawn. Delivery vans lined the quay, and children from the neighborhood pressed their faces to the windows, trying to glimpse the miracle everyone was talking about. Inside, life had settled into a rhythm no one had planned and everyone now needed. Annabella stood in the largest therapy room, sunlight pouring through the skylight onto a circle of young clinicians who had come from 5 continents to learn what could not be taught in any medical school. They sat cross-legged on the honey-colored floor while she held a silicone practice doll against her chest. "Feel the placement," she said softly, guiding a pediatric resident's hand to the hollow just below her collarbone. "The sternal notch is the doorway. The vibration has to reach the mastoid process without force. It's invitation, never intrusion." She hummed a low, steady tone. The doll was only silicone, but every person in the room felt the answering warmth in their own inner ears, the way pressure equalized without effort. A young doctor from Sao Paulo closed his eyes and exhaled as though surfacing from deep water. Annabella smiled, small and tired and radiant. "That's it. You're not fixing them. You're reminding them they already know how to heal." In the corridor outside, Shelby wrestled with a stroller that refused to collapse. Lina, now 14 months and fiercely opinionated, stood beside him holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear, offering unhelpful commentary in enthusiastic gibberish. Gone was the billionaire who once commanded fleets of assistants. Here was a man in jeans and yesterday's shirt, hair standing up from sleep, trying to fold aluminum tubing with one hand while keeping his daughter from darting into the path of a passing electrician. "Need a boardroom for this negotiation?" Annabella called from the doorway, laughter in her voice. "Desperately," he muttered, then grinned when the stroller finally clicked shut. Lina rewarded him with a triumphant clap and the word she had been practicing for weeks. "Mama." She said it to Annabella, arms raised, rabbit abandoned on the floor. Clear as birdsong through the construction noise. Annabella froze in the doorway, sunlight catching the sudden tears in her eyes. Lina said it again, impatient now. "Mama." "Up." The clinicians behind her went very still. They had heard the story, of course, everyone had, but hearing the word fall naturally from this child's mouth was something else entirely. Annabella crossed the distance in 3 strides, lifted Lina, and pressed her face into the warm baby neck that smelled of milk and spring air. Lina patted her cheek with sticky fingers, satisfied. Shelby watched them, throat working. He had known this moment was coming, he had felt it gathering like dawn. Still, hearing it aloud cracked something open in him that would never close again. Later, when the sun was high enough to turn the river silver, the 3 of them walked the gravel path along the Seine. Lina rode on Shelby's shoulders, chubby hands buried in his hair for balance, legs kicking happily. Annabella walked beside them, satchel replaced now by a simple canvas bag that held bottles and sunscreen and the small things families carry. They moved slowly, the way people do when they are afraid the moment might bruise if handled too quickly. Tourists passed with cameras and maps, oblivious to the quiet miracle in jeans and a cream cardigan, the same cardigan, now washed soft and mended at the cuffs. At Pont de El Alma they stopped to watch the boat slide beneath them. Lina pointed at a barge painted bright blue and shouted boat, with grave authority. Annabella laughed, the sound light and startled, as though joy still surprised her. Shelby set Lina down on the stone parapet between them, his hands never leaving her waist. She leaned toward Annabella, confident she would be caught, the way children are when they have never once been dropped. Annabella lifted her, settled her on one hip, and kissed the top of her head. Lina tucked her face into Annabella's neck and sighed the deep, trusting sigh that had once belonged only to dreams. Shelby reached into his pocket and drew out a slim leather folder he had carried for weeks, waiting for the right morning. "I had the lawyers draw this up," he said quietly. "It's co-guardianship. Full legal rights. Your name beside mine on every document that matters. If anything ever happens to me..." Annabella's breath caught. She will never wonder who her mother is. She already knows. He opened the folder. The papers were simple, almost austere. Lina McClure Boyd. Guardians, Shelby James Boyd and Annabella Claire McClure. Annabella stared at the words until they blurred. Then she looked up at him, eyes swimming. "You would do this?" she whispered. "I've already done it," he said. "I'm only waiting for your signature." Lina, sensing the shift, lifted her head and patted Annabella's wet cheek again. "Mama sad?" "No, darling," Annabella managed, voice breaking on every syllable. "Mama's not sad." She cried harder than she had the day on the plane, harder than the night she told Shelby about Eloise, harder than the evening Paris first heard her sing again. These were not tears of grief, they were the kind that come when a heart, long accustomed to carrying pieces, discovers it has been made whole without warning. Shelby wrapped his arms around both of them, Lina squished happily in the middle, and held on while Annabella shook against his chest. Passers-by smiled and looked away, giving the little family the privacy joy sometimes needs. When the storm passed, Annabella took the pen he offered. Her hand did not tremble. She signed her name in the place marked, the ink dark and certain against the pale paper. Annabella Claire McClure. She closed the folder and handed it back to him. Lina, bored with adult emotion, wriggled down and toddled toward a pigeon. Shelby caught her before she reached the edge, swinging her high until she shrieked with laughter. Annabella watched them, father and daughter silhouetted against the glittering river, and felt the last shard of the old wound slide into place. She had lost one child to a world that could not hold her. She had been given another by a world that finally understood how. Later that afternoon, back at the center, the three of them stood in the almost finished rooftop garden. Cherry petals drifted across the pale wood decking and caught in Lina's curls like tiny crowns. The city spread below them in every direction, soft and golden in the spring light. Annabella lifted Lina so she could see over the railing, pointing out the Eiffel Tower glowing in the distance. "Home," Lina said clearly, waving one sticky hand at the view. "Yes, darling," Annabella answered, pressing a kiss to the warm baby temple. "We're home." Shelby came to stand behind them, arms encircling both his daughters, because that was the only word left that fit. Together they watched the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky the same rose it had worn the morning everything began. No cameras recorded the moment. No headlines announced it. It belonged only to them, a billionaire who had learned to change diapers with one hand, a woman who had found her voice again in a baby's giggle, and a little girl who had two people to catch her if she ever fell. The center would open in 3 weeks and save thousands. But on that quiet rooftop, with petals in their hair and Paris breathing below them, the first healing had already happened. The family no one saw coming had, against every odd, arrived. 3 weeks later, Paris woke to a morning so clear the sky looked newly washed. At dawn the Lina McClure Center stood complete, its curved facade catching the first light like a shell held to the sun. White banners snapped gently in the breeze, bearing only the simple outline of a child's open hand and the words "Free to every child" in 20 languages. No ribbon, no brass band, no politicians on the steps. Shelby had insisted on that. This day belonged to the children. By 7 o'clock the queue already stretched along the quay and disappeared around the corner toward Pont de la Concorde. Families had come from every continent, a mother from Lagos cradling a feverish toddler, a father from Sapporo carrying his daughter on his back because the stroller had broken on the flight, grandparents from Bogota who had sold their television to buy plane tickets. They stood quietly, some exhausted from red-eye journeys, some tear-streaked, all holding the same fragile hope. Inside, the staff moved on silent feet. The residence rooms glowed with warm wood and hidden speakers tuned to the exact frequencies Annabella had mapped months ago. Parent pods waited with soft blankets and dim lamps. The emergency wing doors stood open to the street, exactly as she had drawn on that first pizza box. Shelby walked the corridors one last time, Lina on his hip in a pale yellow dress, her hair tied with two tiny ribbons the color of cherry blossoms. She pointed at everything and declared pretty, with grave authority. Every person they passed smiled as though the child herself were the blessing. Annabella waited in the circular reception hall, wearing the same cream cardigan, now immaculately clean, over a simple white dress. She looked calm, but Shelby saw the faint tremor in her hands. This was the moment she had feared and dreamed in equal measure, the day her voice would no longer belong only to the dark corners of hospitals and airplanes, but to the light. At precisely 9 o'clock the great doors opened. The first family through was a young couple from Marseille. Their 6-month-old son, Matteo, had not stopped crying in 27 days. Colic, reflux, possible neurological distress, no diagnosis fit, no treatment worked. The mother's eyes were hollow with exhaustion, the father carried the baby against his chest as though afraid to hope. Annabella knelt so she was eye level with them. "May I?" she asked softly. The mother handed Matteo over without a word. The baby's cry was thin, ragged, the sound of something breaking slowly. Annabella settled him against her collarbone exactly as she had once settled Lina, exactly as she had once settled Eloise. She did not rush. She simply breathed with him for a moment, letting him feel the steady rise and fall that had become his new definition of safety. Then she began to sing. Not the lullaby, not yet. A low, wordless hum that started in the soles of her feet and rose through her chest like warm water. The cry faltered. Hitched. Stopped. Matteo's eyes, squeezed shut for weeks, opened wide and fixed on her face. His tiny fists uncurled. A sigh left him so deep it seemed to come from another lifetime. The father made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. The mother covered her mouth and wept without shame. Around them the hundreds waiting in the hall went still, as though the whole building had drawn one breath and held it. Annabella kept singing, shifting now into the ancient Provençal lullaby that had traveled from a hospital room in Lyon to an airplane over the Atlantic to this sunlit morning in Paris. Matteo's head lolled against her shoulder in perfect trust. When the last note faded, he was asleep. Someone in the back began to clap. The sound spread until the hall rang with it, not applause but gratitude, raw and overwhelming. Phones rose, live streams flickered on, and within minutes the world was watching again. The day unfolded like that, child after child carried in, placed in Annabella's arms or the arms of the clinicians she had trained, and given back to their parents quieter, lighter, sometimes laughing. The residence rooms filled with soft humming. Parent pods became sanctuaries where mothers finally slept while their babies breathed evenly for the first time in months. By late afternoon the queue had barely shortened, but no one complained. They stood in the spring sunshine sharing water bottles and stories, passing babies from arms to arms like a single extended family. Shelby found Annabella at 5 o'clock in the rooftop garden, sitting on the edge of the fountain, shoes off, feet in the water, Lina asleep against her chest. The city was turning gold around them. He sat beside her and handed her a slim envelope without ceremony. "Margot had it couriered from the tribunal this morning," he said quietly. "It's final. No hearing required." The judge signed it the moment he read the file. Annabella opened the envelope with careful fingers. Decree of adoption. Lina Marguerite Boyd McClure. Mother, Annabella Claire McClure. Father, Shelby James Boyd. The paper trembled in the breeze. She read it 3 times, as though the words might rearrange themselves if she blinked. Then she looked at Shelby, eyes brimming. I thought co-guardianship was already more than I could ask, she whispered. You never asked, he said. We just became. Lina stirred, blinked awake, and immediately reached for Annabella's face with both hands. Mama, she said clearly, as if the word had always belonged to her. Annabella's tears fell onto the adoption decree, blotting the ink in tiny perfect circles. Shelby moved closer, wrapping an arm around them both. The sun balanced on the horizon now, spilling fire across the Seine, turning the center's windows into 1,000 burning hearts. Annabella lifted her face to the light and began to sing again, softly, just for the two people who had given her back the life she thought she had buried. The lullaby rose and fell with the river, with the city, with the years that had tried to break them and failed. Lina hummed along in her sleepy baby voice, one tiny hand curled tight around Annabella's finger. Below them, the center glowed, every window lit, every room holding a child who would sleep tonight without pain. Boats passed on the water, their reflections scattering the building into fragments of gold. And somewhere beyond the reach of cameras, beyond headlines and hashtags, a woman who had once believed her song was finished discovered it had only been waiting for the right hearts to carry it forward. The sun slipped below the horizon. The first stars appeared. Annabella kept singing. The city listened. And high on the rooftop, under a Parisian sky vast enough to hold every note of joy and grief they had ever known, a family in all but paperwork became a family in truth. Sometimes the cry that breaks your heart is the same note that puts the pieces back together. Fade on Lina's tiny hand curled around Annabella's finger while the lullaby drifts into the night, soft and endless as the river itself.